Thank you for joining us all today. I'd like to welcome you all to the Fall 2022 Communication Studies Speaker event. This is an event that we used to do pre-pandemic, don't you love those words, live and in the auditorium. This is the first time that we are offering this in 3 different modalities. So it's great to see you all live in person. We also need to give a shout out, hello, to all of our students that are on the live stream with us today. And then also this will be recorded and posted in your Blackboard Learn classes. So you have the time to go back and see it again if you would like. We are excited. We bring this program to you every year, every semester, and our goal here really is connecting what you learn in your communication classroom with community issues that are of relevance and importance. So it's usually a collaborative event, and it kind of grows with our department and excitement as we get excited for the different series and things that we can cover. And so this semester we started and thought, hey, we want to focus on our health communication program. And then before we knew it, we started talking amongst ourselves and realized we could also bring in our public deliberation program. So we're super excited to bring a distinguished panel of guests to you today. The Women's Fund, who we work with, our health communication program, has set up information in the back of the room at the conclusion of our event. If you'd like to speak with them, we have representatives from there. And they have brought with us Dr. Frene LaCour-Chestnut from UH Medical School. We also, our Center for Public Deliberation helped us bring our second speaker, Dr. John Gastel. He is from the, I started to say the wrong university, Penn State. And then our very own Dr. Ashley Archiopoli, who is the chair of our Communications Studies program, and many of you all know as one of our outstanding professors here. So basically this format, we want to make it casual, conversational. We want to engage with you all because isn't it awesome that we are engaging both online and in person once again? And so we will start out with them briefly presenting their expertise in the area. They will each present. I will introduce them before they each present, and then we're going to open it up to question and answers. So as you all were coming in this room, Professor French gave you a note card. As somebody speaks and you hear something that's of interest to you and you would like to know more about it, please write that down on that card. When we get to the Q&A, Mr. French will be coming along to collect those questions. Those of you online with us today, please go to the Q&A and enter questions as they come up, and I will be moderating that over here, and I will bring up your questions for us. Now, a few housekeeping issues, and one that's of major importance to many of you in this room is, how will my professor know that I'm here? If you signed in outside before you walked in, I will get your name and information to your professor. If you did not, you can do that when you leave. If you're on the live stream, we are actually getting a list of your attendance, and I will be emailing that out to your professors. Okay? All right. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Frene LaCour-Chestnut. She is an associate professor in the Department of Clinical Sciences for the Tillman J. Fertitta College of Medicine. She is responsible for directing the longitudinal integrated clerkship as a part of the clinical curriculum. A primary care physician and a clinical educator with a focus in internal medicine and pediatrics, Dr. LaCour-Chestnut is passionate about providing primary care to underserved urban communities, encouraging trainees to pursue careers in underserved urban communities, and partnering with community organizations to provide health education to the public. Dr. LaCour-Chestnut earned her bachelor's degree in biology from Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University and then attended Baylor College of Medicine. She did her residency training here as well. She is an active member of the American College of Physicians, Mary Susan Moore Medical Society, and serves on the advisory board for the Women's Fund. We are so happy to have you here with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you guys. So happy to be here and to be able to speak with you today about building healthier communities through communication and how understanding trauma and trauma-informed care can benefit building some of those healthy communities. So we'll start off first with just discussing what is trauma. What is the definition? As a physician, it's important that we understand the 3 E's of trauma, which are an event or series of events or set of circumstances that's experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and has lasting effects on the individual. So those are the 3 E's. It's an event or series of events. It's experienced by the individual. So it doesn't mean what you feel is traumatizing or what's traumatizing to you is traumatizing to somebody else and vice versa. And it has to have lasting effects on the individual. So if it doesn't have lasting effects, then it's not necessarily for that person a traumatizing event. So why is that important? It's important as a physician when you're building relationships with patients to understand that we all have typically experienced some type of trauma. Trauma is ubiquitous. About 90% of American adults report that they have experienced some type of traumatic event. When we talk about when those events occur, one really impactful time for traumatic events to occur are in childhood. And those are the ones that have a definite long-lasting effect on those people who experience them during childhood. There's been a lot of studies that have delved into adverse childhood experiences and how they correlate with negative health outcomes and why that's the case. When we're talking about adverse childhood experiences, those can be physical, emotional, or sexual abuse or neglect. And can also include things such as mental illness or being exposed to mental illness in the family or in the household, having a parent or a family member that's incarcerated during childhood also is considered an adverse childhood experience, divorce or separation in the family, as well as being exposed to domestic violence or intimate partner violence in the home. So these things really shape children as they experience them and are traumatizing. The NIH did some studies after, actually Kaiser did some of the initial studies and then NIH went a little bit further with some of those. Those initial studies showed us that there are, in terms of adults, there are some who experience no adverse childhood events. That's about 37% of people. But if you see that the rest of them, more than 60% of people, experienced one or more adverse childhood events during their childhood, including the ones that we mentioned before. And what have we seen? Those people with more than 4 adverse childhood experiences have negative outcomes in terms of their health. So if you experience those traumatizing events, you have potentially, if you have 4 or more of those ACEs, an increased chance for alcoholism, depression, drug abuse, suicidality. In addition to those that seem very severe, also physical inactivity, obesity, higher rates of cancer, and diabetes as well. So it's super important that we know and understand trauma as it relates to our patients, and knowing what we can do in terms of being sensitive to our patients, because at least 60% of them probably have experienced one of these adverse events. With adverse childhood events and their impact on healthcare, impact on health long term, some of the reasons that these traumatizing events in childhood are so impactful in a negative way on health is because you have a lot of the neurobiological connections that are made during childhood. So you have this disrupted neurodevelopment if you're constantly exposed to intimate partner violence in the home. If you are at a developmental stage where it's very important that some of those connections are made to trusted individuals such as family members, but that's disrupted by separation or divorce, that might have a negative impact on some of that child's development. When you have those disrupted neurodevelopmental stages, you get some impairment in social, emotional, and cognitive development. So you then lead to, if you have differences or impairment in your social and emotional well-being and development at that stage, then you start to adopt some risky health behaviors. So that's why we see sometimes children who have been exposed to certain things during childhood, that they then make decisions in terms of their health risk that they might not if they weren't in that situation otherwise or didn't experience that trauma otherwise. That tends to have impact on their life potential, diseases that we just mentioned, and early death. We see that people who have experienced 6 or more adverse childhood events have a life expectancy of 60 years versus somebody who has not experienced any is expected to live to 80 years. So it's not just about that one time or that one traumatic event or series of events, but this does have a lifelong, obviously, impact on those individuals. So it's important as physicians to make sure that you're aware these things are happening around you. You can't just pretend that the life that you lived as a child or as an adult is the same as all of your patients. And so being aware of that and taking into consideration, how do you move as a physician or as a healthcare professional in a way that's sensitive and informed about the trauma that others have experienced. So trauma-informed care is a framework that we utilize that definitely impacts our communication with our patients and the way that we approach our patients. It's a framework to address and mitigate those hopeful health effects. So there's many ways that we can try to target preventing those long-term effects of health, right? Of trauma on your health. One of them several of them should include prevention, right? So we should try to prevent those traumatic events from happening. And then you can also try to treat those after they have happened. When I come in on the back end, I'm going to, as a primary care physician, I might not be preventing or treating those as my primary goal, but I still need to be sensitive and aware that that trauma has occurred. So there's 4 key assumptions that any person, organization, or system who wants to provide trauma-informed care should know about. And then there's 6 key guiding principles. We'll go over those quickly. And then just on the last slide, talk about how we try to incorporate these principles when we're educating medical students and trying to use them as a practicing physician as well. So the 4 key assumptions are the 4 R's. We need to realize that there is a widespread impact of trauma on individuals. We should recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in our patients. We should respond by fully trying to integrate knowledge about trauma into our policies and procedures and the way that our organizations and systems are set up, including our clinics and hospitals. And last but not least, we should try to resist re-traumatizing our patients. There are many ways that we could re-traumatize our patients. If you think of somebody who has been physically abused, who comes into clinic, you may or may not know that the first time you meet that patient. But if you are very forceful with them, if you are forcing them to do things, that might re-traumatize them. If you put certain patients in a room that has no window, as many clinics are, they have no windows, right? No windows, there's no way for them to remove themselves easily from the situation, then you might be re-traumatizing them if they have been in scenarios where they have been unable to escape from certain situations, or they have been, I don't want to say held in bondage, but in some ways they've been unable to escape. So we want to try to resist that. Looking at our systems and our organizations to have those 4 key assumptions in every system or organization is key to building healthier communities when you're trying to adjust from our routine care to utilizing trauma-informed care. Last but not least, these are the 6 guiding principles that we'll go over in the next few slides and how we try to incorporate not only utilizing these tenets as a practicing physician, but also teaching them to our students. So safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. So these are the 6 guiding principles that we want to use within our organizations to make sure that we're providing trauma-informed care, not just your routine care. All right, safety means that people feel not only physically safe, but also psychologically safe. I mentioned a little bit about how in certain spaces, some people may feel unsafe physically, but you also want to take into consideration that it's not just the physical setting, but it's also the psychological setting. Understanding that safety is also defined by those who are served. I might feel safe in a different environment than somebody else who's had different experiences than I in terms of safety. They might not feel safe in that environment. So we need to be aware of that and understanding who your patients are and who your community is that you're serving. Trustworthiness and transparency. This has obviously been a big issue in the medical community. How well can you trust the information that you're receiving? How transparent are we as physicians and as healthcare providers with our patients to make sure that our communities and our individual patients trust what we're saying and trust the information that we're giving to them? So we should take that into consideration. Collaboration, I didn't touch on peer support, but that somewhat is self-explanatory, not just providing support from physicians, but also hopefully incorporating groups or the opportunity for groups and our patients to get together to receive some of that support from each other. Collaboration and mutuality. This somewhat speaks to the fact that you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. So if I have someone who's coming into the clinic, it doesn't just start with me when I enter the room. It starts with the person at the front desk, whoever they encountered when they were in the parking lot. That your collaboration with that person who's coming in, having that mutual respect, sets the stage at every single point to develop a good relationship and making sure that everybody is on board with leveling those power differentials. So we know that there are certain things we can do in terms of our behavior that I'll discuss in just a moment that helps to level that power differential. Empowerment, voice, and choice. So there's been historically in medicine that patients have been guided in a way in terms of their healthcare decision making that hasn't been as empowering for the patient, and it's been more paternalistic, dictatorial to the patients. And we want them to know that you do have a voice in your healthcare, that you do have choice, and empowering them to communicate what their preferences are to us and for us to listen. All right. Also, intertwined into that empowerment, voice, and choice also has a lot to do with cultural, historical, and gender issues. And so we do want all of the patients that we serve, and this has to speak to knowing your community and knowing what subset of patients that you're working with, if there is one, and understanding the cultural and historical context in which they live and move and grew up. When we utilize all of that, changes that we can specifically make in terms of safety for our patients. So if you have a practice that is utilizing trauma-informed care, not just your standard of care, then you want to make sure that you provide a private area to discuss sensitive topics. You won't just out in the open in the emergency room discuss that they found cancer on your CAT scan, okay? You want to make sure that we need to discuss something serious. Let's find a private space to do so. It is one example. Utilizing interpretation services and chaperones when necessary. So if you have someone who's very young and you're caring for their parent and you need to try to communicate to this young person what's going on, then you want to utilize child life services, okay? They can help you be able to communicate to those patients in a way that's more appropriate. Next is trustworthiness and transparency. So the number one thing, I'm definitely haven't taken a communications class since college, but for sure the emphasis needs to be on listening and not always speaking when you're to be able to properly communicate. And I think that is one of the most important skills a physician or a clinician can have, is being able to listen, not interrupting, slowing down, interpreting that medical jargon and all of those terms that you have in your head, and that all those things that have been drilled into you, what's the proper medical terminology, and being able to translate that into plain everyday language. That's how you build transparency and trustworthiness. Offering all of the options and taking the time to explain all of those options not only builds trustworthiness and transparency, but also those relationships, that mutual respect and collaboration. One of the other skills is that when you do utilize some of your sensitive communication techniques, that you also level yourself. You get rid of that power differential. So instead of me standing here and talking to my patient who's sitting down on the chair, how about I sit down on my chair so that we're eye to eye and that we're level, that that person does not perceive that I'm above them. They have, and we have, shared decision-making capabilities, and that they have a voice in their medical care. Asking permission before proceeding to examine patients. This is one of the simplest yet most often forgotten tips in trauma-informed care. Asking permission to touch someone. Just because you are a physician and they came to your office or you're in the hospital does not mean that you have the right, without asking permission, to move into somebody's space. If you have someone who has been traumatized in the past, especially if they've experienced physical or sexual abuse or neglect, that is an area that can be very sensitive, and you can re-traumatize that person very easily. Or you can really form some strong bonds with that person by doing the simple maneuver of asking before performing any physical exam maneuvers. Also, alerting patients as to what's coming next. What should they expect? Oftentimes, we are very busy and we think we've done this procedure a million times. Well, that patient hasn't experienced that a million times. So we need to take a step back and really think about how can we communicate to that patient what they're about to experience and offer them the opportunity to ask questions. Last but not least, sensitive draping. Standing within the patient's sight at all times. Sensitive draping basically means if I'm examining a woman's abdomen, she doesn't necessarily need her breast exposed or her underwear exposed. I can drape the patient so that I'm sensitive to their body and only the parts that need to be examined at that particular point, providing some modesty and some courtesy to that particular patient. All right, we talked about, I must have messed up a little bit on this slide. We talked about empowerment, voice, and choice, and I like to tell my students that, yes, as physicians, you are the experts in disease management and prevention. You know the medicine, you know how to prevent disease, you know how to treat it, but patients are the experts on themselves. So don't discount what they're saying and what they have experienced, but also trying to make those connections via good communication skills, that I understand that you perceive your illness to be caused by XYZ. Well, we think also it could be caused by this. Do you see any connections there? Having those discussions and allowing the patient to express themselves because they are the experts on their body and on themselves. Let's see. Also, we talked a little bit about collaborating with patients, and we really want to maximize the patient-centeredness. The way that you, especially in marginalized communities and for patients who have experienced a lot of trauma and have difficulty with trusting people, you want to make sure that their perspective is respected, that they know and understand that you are there for them, they aren't there for you. I think during the pandemic, we really saw how we can go to people. We don't have to require them to come to us in terms of their clinic. We can provide medical care through telemedicine, through telephone, through many other ways that actually reaches the patient where they are, and not requiring them to come to our office, to come to our hospital, to come to see us. And it, I think, shifts the focus to being more patient-centered. Last but not least, cultural, historical, and gender issues, asking about preferred names and pronouns, is just a tip of the iceberg of what we can do to provide trauma-informed care to our communities. We should ask about and acknowledge cultural differences and traditions. So I like to make sure that if there is a family who or a patient who believes that this is we're going to go and pray about this issue first, and then we'll come back and see about your medication. I wholeheartedly believe that whatever your cultural or religious traditions, if they are not harmful to your medical condition, that you should do them. That definitely, we know that healing occurs not only in the treatment of disease with medication and interventions, but that healing occurs through spiritual interventions when people believe those as well, and that they don't have to be mutually exclusive, that you can do more than one thing at once. All right, so the future directions are basically that I think as organizations and systems, we need to adopt these assumptions and these guiding principles, and how do we organize those into our policies and procedures. But also we need to recognize that our students are amongst the people, so they too, probably 60% or more of them have experienced trauma or adverse childhood events. And how are we incorporating that into medical education? Not to treat those students as patients, but to provide that perspective. So while they are being educated in medical school, we aren't after the fact realizing and trying to teach people out of their ways that they've been set in for a while, but that we're teaching them how to do this from the beginning, that providing trauma-informed care is ingrained in our medical education. So those are what we hope are some of the future directions, are teaching medical students from the beginning how to utilize these approaches, not correcting them after the fact. So those are the ways that we hope that we can build healthier communities.
I appreciate that. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. John Gastel. Dr. John Gastel earned his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a distinguished professor in the Department of Communication Arts and Sciences and Political Science at Pennsylvania State University, where he is a senior scholar at the McCourtney Institute for Democracy. Dr. Gastel's research focuses on the theory and practice of deliberative democracy. The National Science Foundation has supported his research on the Oregon Citizens Initiative Review, the Australian Citizens Parliament, and American juries. His most recent books are Hope for Democracy, published by Oxford in 2020 with Catherine K. Knobloch, and Legislature by Lot, published by Verso in 2019 with Eric Olin Wright, along with 2 novels published in 2020. With that, I give you Dr. John Gastel.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who invited me here, especially John Roundtree, for helping to find this connection to this panel today. I was once advised that when you are on a panel or giving a talk on the order of 15 minutes, a realistic goal is to share with people one thing that they will actually tell someone else. That little anecdote or that little bit, you're like, that's cool, I'm gonna hang on to that. So I promise you the one thing, and the one thing will be the word mini-public, just to give you a heads up. I think some of you will repeat it to someone else. It's not as exciting as like a 3-run homer in the bottom of the ninth, just to take a hypothetical example. Go Stros. And sorry about Verlander, I'm a Tigers fan, so that's on me. But hopefully it will be memorable, and we'll get there. There is a tie-in. Frene's talk, there's a lot of threads we could pull through here, but the strongest one was talking about patient voice, choice, and empowerment. The idea that a patient should be, in a sense, kind of self-governing, should be self-evident, right? These are our medical decisions, our choices that we're making in collaboration, hopefully, with healthcare providers, not under their direction. When we step out of the healthcare setting and we talk about what it's like to live in a democratic society, one would hope voice, choice, and empowerment would also be strong themes. And that's where I'm going to be coming from today. As you suggested, the Center for Public Deliberation here at the university is one of the reasons I'm here, and that's my connection. That word deliberation is really at the heart of what I study. So all of you are in one way or another communication students. And part of what I want you to appreciate about the panel today is you're going to hear so many different aspects of communication, from patient-provider communication all the way to how you talk with fellow citizens and public officials in a democratic society. The core idea of democracy is self-government. It's this crazy notion that we should make our decisions about public problems as a public. Now, there's a whole bunch of different ways of doing that that are legitimately democratic, lots of different systems and designs out there in the world. But all of them seem to be lacking in one important respect. Joan Tronto, a political theorist, wrote a book called Caring Democracy, in which she argued that a really healthy democracy, time and again, comes back to questions of care. How should we care for each other? How should we care for those who most need our help? And too often, unfortunately, democracy is about what you see on the news. It's about power. It's about brinksmanship. It's about games. Who's winning? Who's losing? Who can control the most resources and direct them to sustain their power base? I used to run political campaigns. Both of my parents have run for Congress. I am not alien to politics. I understand how it works, and I understand what it takes to win an election. They lost theirs. But that doesn't mean that we can't be aspirational. As a communication scholar, often you feel like you're learning how to do things, but there are lots of different questions we answer in this field from humanistic and social scientific perspectives. Some of those questions are, how should we be doing things? What would be the best way to do it? And that's a moral judgment. And we make those all the time when we say what's appropriate rhetoric, what's a manipulative way of making an argument versus a persuasive and legitimate, a deliberative way of doing it. We also make design choices. As communication scholars, we don't just say, here's how to run a meeting, here's how to give a speech. We often invite you to be creative. What would be a different way of conducting that meeting? What would be a different way of persuading someone, or listening even? Just to give you one example that you might have experienced, show of hands, did anyone happen to have conflict mediation as part of their K through 12 experience? Where there was a mediator at your school? No hands? Nobody? They are here and there. Maybe it's not a Texas thing, but it didn't used to exist. When you had a conflict on your school grounds, there were a couple basic resolutions. One was somebody beats somebody else up, and you get a point on your ACEs score if it's broadly defined. Another was that you go to a teacher and get it resolved and be branded as a snitch. Having a peer mediator was actually a new concept. And it's been very successful in a lot of schools where students are helping students resolve conflicts through peer mediation. The point is that was invented. As much as it's kind of an obvious thing that we could have been doing all along. When I was a kid, no one had invented it, or at least it hadn't caught on. But now it's very common, apparently not in Texas. But that's just one example of how communication scholars worry not only about what should be, but then they start to think about how we could design things to be differently. We're coming back to the word deliberation, this time through the work of Jane Mansbridge, a former president of the American Political Science Association. She wrote a lovely book called Beyond Adversary Democracy, which kind of gives away the plot. She was concerned about how democracy had become purely adversarial. That's adversaries, warring, fighting, conflict. And democracy is about conflict. And sometimes it is about having more votes or fewer votes, winning and losing. That's all true. But her point was that if you look at democratic theory in its earliest and strongest formulations, it has a balance between adversarial and unitary impulses. That is, we might disagree, let's go ahead and have that disagreement, but we should also recognize things we have in common, things that bring us together. The theory of deliberative democracy grew partly out of her work on the idea that, maybe it's great that we have so many good institutions that are part of our democratic system, but we don't have strong deliberative traditions. So what does that mean, to have a deliberative democracy, to be deliberating? Well, we don't hear the word deliberation very often, but there's probably one context in which you have heard it, jury deliberation, right? A jury deliberates. Now, juries aren't perfect. Juries don't always deliberate. They do go into a deliberation room. Sometimes they make a mess of it. But more often than not, they actually do okay. And you have to ask yourself, are they better than the alternative, which is usually a judge, or in the case of some countries, a small panel of judges. The concept of jury deliberating, a jury of your peers deliberating, is a very old idea that suggests that, sometimes we just have to accept that there isn't a single objective truth. We're going to try to get a few perspectives, bring them together, present them with the evidence, and let them make a determination, usually a determination of fact. So was this person guilty or not guilty? Was a civil offense committed? And then that jury deliberates and renders a verdict or a judgment. That is not a bad approximation of what deliberation and in democracy is all about. Another way of thinking of it is you can say that a democratic deliberative process, like again, the Center for Public Deliberation here at the University of Houston downtown, has a couple aspects to it. One is this sort of rigorous analysis. When you're deliberating, you're looking closely. And in fact, in jury research, we refer to something called an evidence-driven jury versus a verdict-driven jury. So imagine you and 11 other people are sitting in the jury room. You've just heard a trial go on for a couple days. Now it's time to deliberate. A verdict-driven jury comes in the room, and the foreperson says, hey, let's just do a quick straw poll. Guilty or not guilty? That is a verdict-driven jury. That is a jury that wants to get home and be done, and it's got 11 guilty votes. So you look at the 12th and go, come on now. An evidence-driven jury would have a foreperson who says, hey, I know you all got your first impressions of this case, but let's actually slow down and let's walk back through the evidence together. And then maybe after a few hours, we'll talk about verdicts. Let's start with the evidence. That's the rigorous aspect of a deliberative democracy. And again, when you think about politics, American politics, and you think about deliberative democracy, you may be thinking about two things that feel completely unrelated. Just think of them as, opposite sides of a coin, if that works for you. They are sadly opposites in many regards. What I just described as a rigorous process of analyzing the evidence and arriving at a judgment that is well informed by the facts, that is so often not what we're doing when we make policy decisions. So much so that actually one of the oldest and most influential think tanks in America, the Rand Corporation, has created a program called Truth Decay. They're in love with the dental pun, just let them have it. But you can imagine that a think tank devoted to evidence-based policymaking might have itself a little bit of a freak out when it starts to think that policies aren't being made based on evidence anymore. That's kind of their jam. So, the very existence of the Truth Decay program is one indication of just how serious this problem of the lack of deliberation has become. But there's a second side to deliberation, which is about the democratic social relations among the people deliberating. In this case, think of the jury. It's great that they analyze the evidence, but did they treat each other terribly? Were there all kinds of forms of disrespect, inequality going on in that jury room? We don't want that. We want a democratic deliberation. We want that social relationship to be egalitarian and respectful, and we want the analytic aspect to be rigorous. If you put those two things together, it's kind of peanut butter and jelly. And apologies if you don't like peanut butter or jelly. I do not understand you. But I respect that you don't yet understand what a great sandwich that can be, as long as it's not grape jelly. When you bring together the democratic and the deliberative aspect, you really do have something. You have a process that is both kind of inclusive and engaging and empowering and rigorous and serious, right? Now, I promised there would be something for you to take away, not the peanut butter and jelly joke or the gratuitous Astros reference. It is, as promised, the word mini-public. So how can you hold a deliberation on the public health issues that we have as a country? Questions during COVID about privacy and safety and public health. Questions at any time about how clean our water or air are, what kinds of health experiences larger populations are having, inequities across populations, right down to the minutia of how many patients should a nurse have responsibility for at a time in a hospital. These are all public questions. Remember, democracy is about how we choose to govern ourselves. It's about the choices we're making together about what kind of a world we should have, or as remember Joan Toronto would say, how we care for each other. Well, a mini-public is one design solution. If you can invent a peer mediator, you can also invent a mini-public. Now, what is a mini-public? Well, a not bad example of it is one that John and I had the chance to observe in Oregon, the ORCA, as I like to call it, the Oregon Citizens Assembly. So in the state of Oregon, during COVID, there was this question of how should the legislature be responding to the COVID crisis. And so some folks who had run mini-publics many times said, hey, let's convene an original one just for COVID and do it virtually. So First, a mini public is usually a random sample. So they got 36 Oregonians, all walks of life, young, old, urban, rural, you name it. You take those 36 people and you bring them together for a period of time. Sometimes it's a week. In this case, I think it was like 7 2-hour sessions. And you usually pay them. In this case, it was $700 for 14 hours of your time. That might seem like a lot, but it's actually a lot of work. And the point of paying is you actually get a broadly representative random sample. The only group you tend to underrepresent are the absolute very wealthiest, who $700 is not enough for 14 hours of their time. That's fine. They have plenty of political representation. Fear not, they'll do okay. And a mini public also usually has a very specific charge. In this case, they were given the question of what advice or guidance can we give to the state legislature for how to respond to COVID? And they took it up quite well. The deliberation then is usually very structured in a mini public, this little small microcosm of the larger public, and they deliberated through these questions and arrived at some very straightforward recommendations about everything from vaccines to public education. What I want you to appreciate is a couple things. One is, that may sound and look a little bit like a jury. It is a little bit like a jury, but it's very different. It's not about a case. It's not about a particular question of guilt or innocence. It's about a larger public issue. Second thing I want you to appreciate is this concept of a mini public. You could do a lot with it. You could apply it to a lot of cases. So just in the last couple minutes here, I'll give you a couple examples that float around. Erica Blackshear at the Center for Practical Bioethics has been designing mini publics that can be created on the fly for health, kind of public health emergencies. And she's been bringing together these kind of sample mini publics just to prove to the public officials in Kansas and Missouri that this is a thing. Citizens can actually do a great job. Give them an agenda, give them access to high quality information. They can work through all kinds of differences. What you see on MSNBC or Fox News is not what people are like when you actually bring them together to talk. In the Netherlands, they have a Citizens Assembly for Healthcare now that's going to be starting in 2023, where just as a regular thing, you will have this assembly on tap. You want to talk about health inequities? Send it to the Citizens Assembly. Let them work through it. Yeah, we can elect public officials. We can elect city councils, state legislatures, Congress, Senate to work through these issues, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they do well. But it can really be something to go right back to the source, to that idea of everyday citizens, residents in a community, for example, and ask them to deliberate. Provide them with the tools, the information they need, and each other's company and enough time, and you may discover that they can do a remarkable job that can actually change the way we make decisions, and importantly, the actual content of those decisions we make about public health questions. So, communication scholars all, just appreciate how many things happen in this field. We can talk about doctor-patient interaction, we can talk about democracy itself, and we can talk about other issues, as you'll hear in a second. Thank you for your time and interest. Go Astros.
Thank you, Dr. Gastel. Our last speaker today is Dr. Ashley Archiopoli. She received her PhD from the University of New Mexico. She's an associate professor of communication studies here at UHD and is also our program coordinator of communication studies. So all those classes you register for, guess who designs the schedule and sets up everything? Yes, if you have any questions after, I'm sure she'd love to address them with you. So she has research that kind of follows two different streams. First, as a health communication scholar, she investigates issues related to the quality of life of individuals and communities, such as health-related stigma and disease prevention. Her second stream of research focuses on creating rich and equitable learning environments. She employs a variety of research methods, but engagement with community members is included in all aspects of her work. Many of you here in this room know that she is an exceptional professor, and we are so happy that she is here with us today. Dr. Archiopoli.
Okay, that is a lot to live up to, so I hope that I do that today. So I want to begin with reflecting on what is our mission today. There was an abstract, if you looked closely at the flyer, there was an abstract and I helped Bridget to write that. And so as I was rereading it, I said, this is really well written. And then I realized I wrote it. And so it really comes from my perspective, but there's a few things I want to focus on. The future of healthy communities depends on the quality of communication and relationships formed in everyday spaces, as well as healthcare settings. This event highlights the intersection of communication, community, and our physical, social, our physical, our mental, and our social well-being to build a healthier tomorrow. So there's a few things that I want to highlight there for us. First is our definition of health. So if you've ever taken a health communication course or have done any studying in health, you know that that is the WHO definition of health. Right? So health is not just merely the absence of disease or infirmity, but it's looking for an overall or overarching wellness in terms of our physical, our mental, and our social well-being. So we need all of those pieces to work together to be able to look at a higher quality or to say that someone is living a healthful life. And so that's really important here. So that's one piece I want to highlight is that definition that we're working off of. And so we heard from the clinical perspective, and we talked about what that looks like clinically. And there's so many ties and so many, to take your word, threads that go through that. Then we talked about the environment of these democratic, these deliberative practices. And what I want to focus on today is going to be those everyday spaces, because everyday spaces is where our life is lived. Our life is lived there. These are the interactions that we're having with our friends, with our family, with our acquaintances. Now, we're all in different stages of life. Some of us might be younger, some of us might be older, some of us might be in a similar stage, but even different. So a lot of my examples right now, and in all of my teaching and in everything I've always done, I've pulled examples from my life because I feel like it's meaningful to hear those examples, to pull in personal examples. So my personal examples might not be meaningful to you, but they're genuine and they develop a sense of authenticity. And that's what I really want you to get from me today, is the authenticity that I share, and then to see the ways that that can be reflected in your own life and your own interactions. So personally, I'm in the phase of life where I have young kids. And I'm not just saying young kids, like they're young. I have 2 little boys. One just turned 2 years old, and my other one is 9.5 months old. Okay, I have little kids. If you know kids, like I am in the thick of it. I am constantly tired, and they're like, they might both be crying at once, or one's crying. Like, it's a lot. Okay, and so that's where I'm at personally, and a lot of my examples come from there. So when I think about everyday experiences, they include my interactions with my colleagues, with my peers, and these panels with my students. They also include interactions with my husband about what does our day look like. It includes interactions with at daycare, pickup and drop off. And I'll be talking about this term that I started calling myself, which is I try to be aggressively nice. And I'll tell you more about what that means to me when it comes to building these relationships. So I'm in the thick of it. This is where my examples come from. So I'm gonna tell you this story. And I went through some stories in my head. What am I going to talk about? What do I want to share with these students, and what am I processing? So we're all continuously processing things as they're happening to us, as they're occurring, and what we've reflected on. And and a lot of my work focuses on the aspect of storytelling and telling stories as a way to understand our lived experience. And so I'm thinking through my head, okay, what story do I want to tell? And don't feel bad for me. I'm going to tell you this. My grandfather died last night. And my grandfather died last night, and I didn't have a close relationship with him. He was my mother's father. And so I thought, do I tie that in some way? You know, because it's still something that I'm dealing with, I'm grieving, I'm processing it. And someone said, well, don't talk about that because that might make you cry. And I thought, maybe, I don't think it will, but the story that I'm gonna tell you might make me cry even more. Which is, it kind of gives you a sense of where you're at. So I just told you my little boy just turned 2. He turned 2 on Monday. My son was born during COVID. So the day the first case of COVID was officially diagnosed in the United States is the same day that I found out that I was pregnant with my son in January of 2020. So I had an entire pregnancy in lockdown, in this kind of like sense of isolation. And he was born, and it was wonderful. But I had and I told you I was gonna cry more thinking about this. So I didn't have a baby shower. I had a virtual this, a virtual that. I did virtual birthing class. They told us to do virtual seat checks, car seat checks. My husband and I joked around that, oh, well, I guess, is the birth gonna be virtual as well? It wasn't. Yeah, that was real. It was in person. He was born. It was wonderful. We brought him here. And then in the span between him turning 2, I had another child. You know, we liked him so much. We were like, let's have another one. And we always planned to have a second child, just maybe not as close as they ended up being. But when it came to my little boy's second birthday, I was like, I am going to make this a thing. Like, this is so important to me. He loves Sesame Street. Do you all know Sesame Street? Okay, so I said I might talk about Sesame Street. Okay, I probably watch more Sesame Street than anyone. We love Elmo in my house, okay? And someone was like, well, they might not know who Elmo is. I was like, they're gonna know. We all know who Elmo is. Okay. So I named his name's Jack. So I made little signs that said like Jack Street. And I spent way too much time designing a birthday invitation. And I sent it out to like the moms I know, right? And I'm so excited. They start coming in. We can't make it. I'm so sorry we can't come. We're not gonna be there. And then I just start crying, like this is my moment, right? Like I'm so excited to do this for him. And then I realized I'm probably dealing with postpartum depression. Like this is a symptom of something larger that's happening to me. And you know what? I went and I sought help, and I've been working with a counselor, and we're talking about physical, mental, and social well-being. My physical health was fine, right? I'm tired. I already established that, right? But I knew my mental health and my social health I needed to work on that. And so I started working with a counselor, and I have felt so much better since I started working with a counselor. And I had that birthday party, and you know what? I sent out those invitations to this whole little class. Tons of kids came. We had the best time. We sang happy birthday to him. He was so happy. It was incredible. And I'm thankful for that experience to highlight to me that maybe I was dealing with some issues that needed to be addressed, right? And so I worked on my social well-being. I worked on my mental health, and all of these things are coming together, right, in better health and better experience. And I tell you that story because I believe that's where community is built. So you might not identify with me. You don't have kids. You don't have a 2-year-old. You're probably not going to watch Sesame Street later. Or you will. I don't know. You might be like, wow, that was really interesting. What's going on? I probably will 100% watch Sesame Street later. That's probably 100% going to happen. But I'm focusing on the vulnerability and telling you all that I have been dealing with and managing postpartum depression and what that experience is like. Because even if you're not dealing with something like postpartum depression, you might have been dealing with depression, an episode of depression, or maybe you're dealing with anxiety or other mental health issues, something that you can approach. And in having someone share in a vulnerable sense, you feel maybe more connected to that person. And I think it's important to have these connections in our everyday spaces, in the places that we live, in the places that we connect. And in the last few weeks, when I've talked to other moms and said, hey, I've been dealing with this, they've said, I've been dealing with that too. I can't find anyone. Do you know? I'm like, well, actually, here, this could be a place that you could go. And we've created that connection and created that vulnerability through that use of vulnerability. So I want to define for us, and I've got notes everywhere, and just cut me off whenever you need me to. I've got notes everywhere, but one thing I want to draw us back to is in my original definition, I've pulled out and defined everyday spaces for us. I've pulled out and I've defined what it means to be healthy and how we define that. And now I want to talk about communication, because as a communication scholar, it's important to always draw it back to the study of communication. And there are lots of different ways that we can define communication. Symbol using, meaning making. My personal favorite definition by Carey, published in 1975, is that communication is defined as a symbolic process whereby reality is produced, maintained, repaired, and transformed. So we are using communication, the ways that we talk to each other in our everyday spaces, to create our realities. And what do we want that reality to look like? And we want to bring it together. We want to recognize what we see in ourselves and how we see that in other people. So I have a few kind of like guiding ways that I think of how we can apply this in our everyday spaces. Number one, recognizing that we need connectedness, and connectedness is developed through this sense of vulnerability. Recognize that we have all moved through collectively the trauma of COVID-19, the collective trauma. We have all had an experience. You're a different person than you were in 2019, before COVID-19 started, before everything impacted us in that way. And some of you probably graduated high school, right? During COVID, and just taking time to reflect on that experience and what that's like, and recognizing that we're all part of this greater psychological experience, and we're a part of that group. And then reflecting on our own life. Like I said, I'm all about storytelling and the stories that we tell. There's 3 different ways that we can look at stories. We can look at the expected story. How do we expect something to work or something to play out? You probably didn't expect to graduate high school virtually, right? That's probably not your expectation, but your lived story is that maybe you did graduate high school virtually. And then you reflect on that. What did that mean to you? And how did that change or impact your life? So we have the story expected, we have the story lived, and then the story in reflection. And these are good ways for us to understand our own experience and then reflect that back out to others. And then my third point then being finding ways that we can be welcoming to ourselves in spaces and know that we belong and we're a part of those spaces and we have value to give to those spaces, and making others feel supported and welcome in those spaces. I find that offering vulnerability is really important. We can also call this identification. This is a rhetorical practice for all my rhetoricians, the points of finding that identification. And then also the other thing that I think is really important is to not discredit the use of online spaces. Even if it's not an in-person space and it's in an online space, you're using a social community. So for example, I kind of have dropped out of kind of being active in a group, but I was in a Reddit group for women who were expecting babies in October of 2020, right? And this was an online space that was important. And I was talking about this. I was dialoguing about my talk earlier, and a friend mentioned this idea of friends for a reason and friends for a season, and understanding the impact that we have as we ebb and flow in and out of each other's lives and in and out of communities. Those communities will be in for a long time, and communities that we're part of for just a piece of time. Or we're always a part of that, but the intensity of it changes and flows with what is needed. Let's see. So I think with all of this to say, I'm sure I've gone long enough. I will say my biggest lesson as I was putting together this talk and thinking and reflecting on how to tie it all together, I want to say that when I watched Sesame Street, that it's actually a really well done show. And I want to say the biggest lesson that I've taken from it, to bring it all together, is just remember just to be a little bit kinder to yourself and to others.
Thank you very much. Okay, so this is now your time to shine, and I do want to give a shout out first to those online. We actually have 121 people online with us right now, so that does make this space a lot larger. And I don't know, is that a mini public or maybe a major public?
Mini major.
A mini major public. Okay. So I do want to encourage you, if you are online with us, please continue to use the Q&A if you have any questions that you would like for me to pose to our panelists. For those of you here, did anybody jot down any questions? If so, Professor French will be wandering around collecting those note cards. If you come up with one, you can raise your hand and kind of wave him over. I've taken some off of the online environment that I will start to post, so you will not be put on the spot. You also are more than welcome to come up here as well if you would like. We've just found that people tend to like to be a little bit more anonymous about all of this. Okay, a few questions that I have is students are concerned with making the connection between all three of you, and that was one thing that we got really excited about when we started planning this event. As I said before, we start and we focus on one area, and we said, well, it's health comms time. We're going to focus on our health comms studies. And then we had the opportunity to bring in public deliberation. We thought, wow, this is really great. We can talk about more things than this. So one of our students picked up on the idea of you discussing traumatic experience, Dr. Gastel talking about deliberation, and then Ashley talking about storytelling. And so they brought up a few questions that I want to just throw out to you all and see how you can combine them. We do have a wireless mic there, so you can all pass it back and forth as you all are comfortable. You can either leave it on the mic stand or remove it. It should be on and ready for you. But a few questions started with Frenae of how do you know if people have had traumatic experiences, or do you just assume everyone has? Because were you all sitting there going, oh, yep, that, yeah, yep. Has everyone had traumatic experiences? Do we assume this? And then Ashley, how or why does talking about this make it better? You mentioned that importance, and that's where I guess we pull in John too, is how do we connect all of those issues? So if you guys just kind of want to jump in and talk about that connection and how we work through that to get us started.
So I'll say to start that we should assume, since we know that in those studies, at least 60% of people, that's the majority, have had at least one adverse childhood experience, and 90% of adults have had some type of traumatic experience when you survey. So we should assume and come into all encounters with the same approach in terms of these are standards, not just trying to target those and guess those who have had trauma. That would be utilizing probably our own stereotypes and biases in order to make those decisions. And so if you always go into every encounter as a physician asking patients, is it okay if I examine you? Is it okay if I listen to your heart? The next step in our encounter will be that I will step out so that you can change into a gown, notifying people. All of those communication techniques should be utilized for everyone, not just those who we know have been traumatized. There's, and I forget who actually gave me this analogy, but if you think about it, all of us have what we would call chairs in a dark room. So the chairs are traumatic experiences that we have experienced. And if you close your eyes and you're going into this dark room, somebody else's chairs are already there. You don't know what they are. You know what your own are. And so, and to avoid tripping over all of those chairs, if you maneuver in the same way with everyone, hopefully you'll avoid some of them. So anyway, that's my thoughts on why we would use trauma-informed care with everybody.
Oh, thank you. So what I will say is to borrow from Frenae's presentation, she said, I don't think I'll get the words exactly right, but it looked at, you don't have to be a mental health counselor to be therapeutic. And that's what we're focusing on is why is storytelling important? Because at its base level, it's therapeutic to share and to understand and to process those stories, whether those be in conversation or within your own telling or retelling. One of the activities that I do in my health communication class is the COVID-19 time capsule. And maybe the time has passed and I might sunset it out of my course, but in the COVID-19 time capsule, I ask everyone just to take a moment to reflect on their experience with COVID-19 and to tell that story as a way of processing it. And I think that giving ourselves the time and the space to process that information through storytelling, it's good for us personally, but then can also reflect out. So I hope that just gives a little bit more detail about why it is important to use these practices.
So I would tie this back to deliberation in a couple ways. One one of the best quotes about one of these mini publics in Oregon called the Citizens Initiative Review, where a small random panel reviews a ballot measure that everyone's going to have to vote on. They write a one-page analysis, and that goes in the official voter's guide. Super helpful to voters, has a big impact on what people know and even how they vote. But a great quote from, I think from the very first one was, one of the panelists was reflecting on his experience, and he said, I didn't know who in the room was a Republican, a Democrat. I was curious at first, but then I lost interest because I became too interested in the other 23 people with me and what their actual experience was and how they understood, in this case, a mandatory minimum sentencing law that had been proposed. And so you kind of dove into the details. Now, storytelling, as it happens, is a big part of deliberation. It's one of the ways people make sense of the world. If you're an attorney and you have to work with a jury, you need to tell your story in a compelling way because it's narrative is how we think. But the story of our lives is so much more compelling when you get into the weeds and surprising. I appreciate your personal sharing there. My ACEs score is between a 4 and a 7, depending on which version of the test you use. And I'm having a good life, but it throws challenges up all the time. That stuff, really can rattle you throughout your whole life. Well, what does that mean? It would take us hours to get to the bottom of what all that meant, that little, disclosure. And you've got just as many interesting, compelling, tragic details in your own life. So deliberating, again, it's not just about getting a bunch of evidence, reasoning through it, and rendering a verdict. It's really about sharing stories and building a collective narrative that is so much bigger than just the sum of, the 12 poll answers we might give if we were just called up in the middle of the night by a pollster. So deliberation really does include all of those elements when it's done well.
Okay, the next one I'm going to ask you just because I'm thinking it might stump you all. This and just give me a one-word answer, and I'll save you all from going deeper into it. But I thought that this was an interesting one posed online. What is the main one issue that we need to solve as a community?
I just got to give Joe Biden's one-word answer: "Made in America." Sorry, that's a news joke.
That's why I said you can just give a one-word answer or a big issue that you think, and then I'll take you off the hook on this one because it's a big one.
This is huge. I don't know about tackling, but I think for today's society, probably, and somewhat of what we've all touched on here, is understanding others. Mm-hmm. That's 2 words instead of 1, but I think that's probably the biggest issue. If we could tackle being able to empathize with and understand others, many of the other issues that we have societally in terms of healthcare, et cetera, trauma for sure, might be impacted. I won't say alleviated, but
Okay.
Yeah, I won't follow the Biden rule of the +1. I will go straight with, we're 2 for 2 here. My one word would be empathy.
I agree with both of you all. Understanding, empathy, to call back to mine, kindness, our community, really building that community.
Okay, thank you. Like I said, I'll take you off the hook. We do this program every semester, and we started it actually right after Hurricane Harvey hit Houston. That was our trigger event that we needed to start this program. And then obviously when Spring 2020 rolled around, that topic fell in our lap. And so when we said, well, it's time to go back to Health COMM, Ashley and I said, can we stop talking about COVID? We're tired about talking about COVID. But here we are today talking about traumatic events. And I think our next 2 questions kind of pull that together. Isn't the COVID pandemic a trauma? So is it still a trauma even though we've all experienced it? And then secondly, will we have another COVID type event in our country? And what do you think we will do different as a society? Have we learned anything?
These are really good questions. I didn't come prepared to speak on them, but my short answers are yes and yes. This question might have been brought up before I mentioned that we all did go through the collective trauma of COVID-19, because Renee had a really great definition, and I'm going to pass it to you because I know you've got more to say. A great definition that looked at, it doesn't matter if someone outside of you thinks it's a trauma, if it changed the course of your life and of your experience, that makes it a trauma. And yes, from a public health perspective, we will have another major public health event. That's just the inevitability of it. And now for the...
I'll let you have the last word. I'll just throw in that, yeah, we're absolutely going to have more traumatic events like this, and it certainly was one. The Quakers, religious organization concerned with peace during World War II, had essentially a line which was, hey, we can't be of much use to you during this war, but we would have been super useful before this war if you'd listened to us. Deliberation is hard to do during a crisis. That's what the Oregon process was about. But really, we need to be deliberating about what can we do to potentially prevent or mitigate flooding before it happens? What can we do to prepare for the next global pandemic, or perhaps change our public health practices to help prevent them? So there's so much deliberation that needs to go on. The challenge is getting people to deliberate when it's not a crisis.
I don't know that I have anything else to add because, I mean, yes, going through a pandemic, if you perceived that as traumatic, meaning it was an event or series of events, the 3 E's of the definition of trauma, it's based on the person who experienced it. And if it has lasting effects, I mean, very easily say that it has had lasting effects worldwide. So it meets all of those definitions. But if there is someone who was not affected by COVID-19, then maybe it was not traumatic to that person. But as a country, as a global society, definitely would characterize it as a trauma. But I do think that we were just discussing up here beforehand, some of the positives that came out of our experiences during COVID-19 and adjustments that we have made, that we have learned from, the ability to host this type of session in person and virtually, and we'll play it back for other people who can learn from and participate in the session. So these are the types of things that you may be able to learn from traumatic experiences and grow and move forward. So.
Okay, and I like to challenge our media services folks, so I'm going to go off camera for a minute with that mic, if you guys can hand it to me, because someone online wrote a very detailed question that I don't trust myself to not read word for word. Are you guys with me still? Okay, you don't have to move the camera. I can be off camera, that's fine. Oh, they're saying no. Okay, I'd like to read one from our online audience. We are seeing the rights of women undermined around the world, not just in places like Iran, where girls are brutally silenced for how to wear their hair, but in democratic societies such as the United States, where abortions are now banned in at least 13 states following the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. As communication experts, what are your suggestions to truly empower, give voice, and allow choices to those whose needs for well-being are being impacted, especially as the young generations are seeing how little control they actually have? That's why I didn't trust myself to transpose it. It's a big one.
Pause for a second.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to buy my colleagues time. And I respect that this answer doesn't directly address that question of what can women do in the United States right at this moment. I want to actually pull us back for a second to the case of Ireland. So if whoever asked that question probably is well aware of the fact that Ireland has now partially legalized abortion for the first time in its modern history. And you probably don't know how that came about. If you do, hey, thumbs up. But Ireland held a constitutional convention and citizens' assembly using mini-publics. That is, initially it was a random sample of the public mixed with legislators, but then the legislators said, you know, we really don't need to be here. They're doing great. And then they continued the deliberation in a second process just with citizens. And Ireland, if you didn't know, is a very Catholic country. And you can imagine being a legislator in Ireland being reluctant to wade into the issue of abortion, on which the Catholic Church in Ireland has a very strong position against choice. But they were comfortable letting citizens deliberate, and that's one of the issues they deliberated on. And what they said is, actually, we think Ireland is ready to change its law. We're not going to ask the legislature to do it, but we're going to ask them to give their blessing to a national referendum on the question. And here's the question we want to put to the public. And then the public of Ireland said, yeah, you know what, we're good. We're ready to proceed with changing the law on abortion. The point is that Ireland successfully experimented with an additional process to the democratic process that helped kind of get around the logjam that the legislatures felt they were in. Legislators obviously being reluctant to offend very powerful special interests, but being comfortable with pushing the question over to the mass public in an election. So again, that doesn't necessarily immediately speak to the question here in the United States, but it does point, again, back to that idea of invention. Think about ways you can change the way politics is done, the way decisions are made, to give a stronger voice to people who may not have one, or in the case of Ireland, honestly, to bring the majority's voice forward when a minority point of view is predominant, which in terms of all the polling in this nation is exactly what happened with the Dobbs decision.
I don't know that I have a full answer to that very difficult question, but I just would say that the communities that are most impacted by these decisions, you see them in these instances, especially in Iran. Those are the women who are most impacted. They are the ones who are protesting. They are the ones who are bringing this forward. We have the benefit of now of having the internet, of having exposure, of having social media that we can utilize for marginalized communities to bring forward the impact of some of the decisions that I don't want to say lawmakers, but the decisions that those are in power are making and how it's affecting, in that case, women, in our case, women. And I think it's super important for those who have the perceived power, those who are in power or perceived power, to make sure that their voices align with those who are marginalized and underserved. Those are the people who these decisions are the most impactful for. And I would just say for any physician who, in the U.S., who does not care for laws being made about how and the repercussions of providing adequate health care, that those voices need to align with those communities that are marginalized, and making sure that those voices are heard is what I would say about the issue with not being able to provide health care to women who need that health care. Since this decision has been made, I have already had a personal experience with a woman who had to leave and go to a different state in order to receive appropriate health care for a pregnancy that was not a viable pregnancy and was dangerous to that woman's health. And in those cases, or at least for me, and in my opinion, it's sad and unfortunate that as a physician, you know what can help this woman, but you maybe either cannot provide those services, or you are at risk of having or are fearful of the repercussions on your livelihood and profession by providing that medical care. So it becomes a very difficult decision. And what I would say is, just for anybody who does not necessarily want that to happen in other areas. So if you would not like to see a physician who can, if somebody's having a heart attack and that will be their demise, that the physician would say, I can't really help you in this scenario. how is that any different? I can't provide that care because somebody might overhear that I'm providing this care for you, and they might report me to the police, basically. And there might be charges that are brought because I provided this life-saving health care for you. Should be in the same vein of, if this is life-saving health care for this woman, that we would not want to infringe upon that either.
My answer is quick. I agree with both everything that my peers said here. Also, speak up. If this is an experience that is happening to you, speak up. This happened to you. People need to know that this isn't just that this type of medical care isn't just for someone who is an other, you've deemed as from a different category and not like you. Speak up. We need to know that there's connectedness in this.
I think we'd also all agree on vote. Please vote. That is a very important form of voice you should use to express your views on this, if you feel you can do that through your vote.
Okay, thank you. Our next one is, I used to live in a community where everyone communicated, but now I've moved into a community where no one communicates at all. How do I bridge that gap?
Oh, you could be my... I promised I would talk about this, but I didn't. Aggressively nice. This is what I am. I'm aggressively nice. So I'm trying to make friends. I'm trying to bring together people in a community. I'm going to use my daycare example. I walk down the halls. Hi, my name's Ashley. I'm so-and-so's mom. How are you? What's going on? How long have you gone here? I'm aggressively nice, trying to build those connections as a way to bring together community, because you might be more extroverted than someone else, and it might be your job to bring together that community. And so that's my TM, my trademark, aggressively nice.
Okay. Okay, I think this one I know is going to Frenay. I know you were about to go on that. I have a few questions, one online and one live, that I'm going to try to combine here. Why does the traumatic event impact life expectancy? Is it because people aren't getting the help that they need or not talking about it? And then somebody also asked here, does the severity of the trauma also affect the lifespan? So I guess quantity, quality sort of questions.
Right now, because of the way the studies were conducted, from what I know, it's more so been the tally of the multiple adverse childhood events that have led to the change in life expectancy. Not necessarily, but as we can all imagine, one traumatic event can really impact someone and can impact their trajectory. But the studies have been done with the quantity of adverse childhood events. But as I showed on the ACE's impact on health, you can see how if there was a child who had these adverse events and they were unable to make those social and emotional connections during that very critical neurodevelopmental time period, and then they begin to make some risky health behavioral choices. So one of the examples I didn't go into in detail has to do with smoking. So children who have multiple ACEs tend to pick up the habit of smoking more often than their peers who have not had adverse childhood events or have had zero. Smoking, as we know, leads to increased rates of heart disease, lung cancer, and so that would decrease your life expectancy. So we need to know, and some of I didn't go into this in this particular talk, but when we talk more about ACEs and their impact on health, what can we do to prevent that? So not just preventing the adverse childhood event, but what can we do to bridge that gap? A lot of it has to do with relationships and making sure that even if there is a child who has had an adverse event or multiple adverse events, how can you bring somebody in? And they have some good examples of like programs such as Big Brothers, Big Sisters, or other community engagement programs that then filter in and support those children to help reverse course. You don't pick up some of those risky health behaviors, and that doesn't lead you to then pick up smoking, and other types of behaviors have also been shown in that manner as well. So those are the ways that it leads to changes in life expectancy. So it's not just about one traumatic event, but the series and then the repercussions of that.
Okay, thank you. Just to end on a lighter note, we do have one final question from our live audience here, and it's an important one. Bert and Ernie or Elmo?
Bert and Ernie.
Elmo's hurt that you have to choose.
That's a good answer. Always Elmo. Always. He's the number one guy. He's the GOAT.
Okay, well, I want to thank all of you that attended here live today on campus and online, and those of you that will be watching the recording in your classes. This event we have every year, and I want to give a shout out to our media services crew. In the back, we've got Dan and Albert, and we've got others online. Also, our event services, Tisha is holding down the fort on the online, and we greatly appreciate her support. We appreciate the support of our department chair, Dr. Azair Rajai, who is with us today. One of our professors in the Center for Public Deliberation, Dr. John Roundtree, is here with us. Mr. French is always my go-to man and helps me with the logistics with this event. Dr. Darius Benton is here. He is on the end. If you haven't checked out our new graduate studies program, please do. We're super excited about that, and he's the leader in that. Our newest faculty member has helped out with our social media this semester, and we greatly appreciate him, and we're glad to have him join our faculty. And we have our distinguished retired Mr. Bill Pogue in the audience today, and we are so grateful for his support as always. Thank you so much for attending today. Thank you to our speakers, Dr. Archiopoli, Dr. Gastel, and Dr. LaCour Chestnut. We greatly appreciate you sharing your expertise. Before you leave today, please talk to the Women's Fund. We didn't get to all the questions, and some of those were actually about some health concerns. They're here. They can help you get connected. We've got some COMM studies swag outside. And if you're online, go grab a coffee and have a great day. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, y'all.